Committee. Just remind everyone that this is streaming, and we started at noon, but the House is on the floor, and it takes a little time to get a quorum, so appreciate everyone's patience. Remember to use your microphones as we are live streaming and turn them on as you use them. Eric Stafford provided our lunch today, and I don't see Eric in the room, but we appreciate that very much. And also, members, remember, if you are unable to attend, get with leadership to get a replacement so that we have a quorum. And also, we had a reminder to submit proposals, audit proposals, but as you have new proposals, make sure you submit those and remind anyone you know who have ideas for an audit to submit those proposals. So we've got two performance audits today, and they're fairly extensive, so we'll move as fast as we can on these. We've got Sam, who's going to present the property tax exemptions audit. And Sam, welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, committee. My name is Sam Dadds. I'm a senior auditor with Legislative Post Audit. Today, I'm going to present our audit titled Reviewing Tax-Exempt Real Property and Property Donated to Universities. So this was a two-question audit. Question one was, what was the estimated amount of foregone property tax revenue to the state and local governments in 2024 due to property tax exemptions? Question two was, how much real property has been donated to the 7 Kansas public universities and their foundations and is exempt from property tax? So we'll start with question one. That begins on page 4, along with some background information. The answer is also found there. The answer to the audit question is, in 2024, real property tax exemptions resulted in counties foregoing an estimated $1 billion in tax revenue, and the state foregoing about $12 million in tax revenue due to real property tax exemptions. So for some brief background information, the Kansas Constitution defines 2 classes of property for taxation. That's real property and personal property. This audit focuses only on real property. Real property includes land, minerals, and improvements on that land, such as buildings, while personal property is every other tangible thing that can be owned that isn't real property, like motor vehicles, machinery, and other equipment. So also on page 4, what you'll see is a formula for how to calculate property taxes. That formula is the appraised value of the property times the assessment rate times the mill levy divided by 1,000. Those terms are explained in this section of the report if you're interested. I won't go into them for time. The formula is important because this is the formula we use to estimate the foregone revenue. So jumping ahead to page 6 and 7, we're going to take a look at figure 2. Figure 2 shows the major sources of tax revenue in Kansas in 2024. The blue bar on the left shows that property taxes were a significant revenue source for state and local governments when compared to other sources of tax revenue. So it made up about 31% when compared to all other tax revenue. However, about 99% of property tax revenue goes to local governments, which means local governments will forego the most revenue from property tax exemptions. So we're going to move ahead to page 7 and 8. You'll find descriptions of how we just grouped the 64 exemption statutes that we reviewed for this audit. Appendix A will list those statutes and how they're included within each grouping. On page 9, we're going to go ahead and move over to page 9. The information in this section is important because it describes the programs that aren't included in this audit. We're going to call off a couple in particular. We didn't review other economic development incentives like tax increment finance districts, reinvestment housing incentive districts, neighborhood revitalization program, and community improvement districts. These programs are all described in more detail on page 9 as well. We didn't include these programs because these incentive programs are not tax exemptions. Secondly, these programs are also administered by local governments. And what that means is there's no centralized database or statewide data on them. Instead, each county and city maintains information for each property or for each incentive program, excuse me. So on page 10, we discuss our methods. To keep these brief, these types of analyses require substantial assumptions about assessment rates and mill levies for exempt properties because these properties aren't used for taxable purposes. And what that means is that data aren't available about how these properties should be assessed. So for example, it's not clear what the assessment rate for a church would be if it wasn't tax exempt because we don't know how it would be used if it wasn't used as a church. So what we did is we reviewed county property records for all Kansas counties and Department of Revenue reports for 2024 to calculate an average assessment rate and an average mill levy for each county based on their taxable property. Then we use those averages to estimate the foregone revenue in each county based on the exempt property's value. And we did this to help control for the different property distributions across the state. If we used a universal assessment rate, like a 25% assessment rate, and a universal mill levy, it would have increased our estimates by about $700 million. So the only properties this method differed for was for IRBX and EDX properties. For those properties, we assumed a 25% assessment rate, and that's because that's the rate for commercial and industrial property. And finally, we use KDOR reports to account for fees, such as payments in lieu of taxes that some taxpayers may pay that offset the revenue lost for property tax exemptions. So moving over to page 12, you'll see the answer to the audit question again. And just to reiterate that, local governments didn't collect roughly $1 billion, and the state didn't collect roughly $12 million in 2024 due to real property tax exemptions. So looking at figure 5 on page 13, figure 5 shows how much property was exempt in each county in 2024 as a percentage. There were 4 counties with exemption rates greater than 30% that stood out to us. In most cases, those high exemption rates were due to large federal exemptions, such as Fort Riley in Riley County. Appendix B shows the foregone revenue estimates and exempt rates by county for 2024. We also have some important caveats to our work on page 15. The most important of these caveats being the reason we couldn't analyze the property data by exemption type. So county records store information about all exempt and taxable real property in Kansas. And in these records, county appraisers are supposed to record why the property is exempt using an exemption code. However, real property exemption codes in the data provided by KDOR were sometimes missing, inconsistent, or incorrect. And that means they weren't reliable enough for us to estimate the foregone revenue by the exemption type. Just as one example, about 7% of the total exempt properties statewide had a blank exemption code in the county data that was provided to us by KDOR. What that means is that we couldn't determine why these properties were tax exempt. There's additional examples in that section of the report if you'd like to read more about the issue. We didn't have any recommendations for this issue. The reasons for that are covered in pages 16 and 17. I won't go into them in detail for the sake of time. So we also had some other findings that start on page 17 of the report. The first of those is that we found some issues with KDOR's statistical report of property assessment and taxation. And that report's missing appraised value information for some of the IRBX and EDX properties. We also identified 2 exemptions in state law that may be outdated. The first referred to a repealed statute that exempts the docking state office building from taxes, and the second was for a statute that exempts the Kansas Bioscience Authority from property tax. The Kansas Bioscience Authority was privatized about 10 years ago. So we didn't do a comprehensive review of the statutory language for each property tax exemption. That means it's possible there may be additional exemptions that are outdated. And this is important because these outdated exemptions may add to the exemption code issues we identified and may allow entities to apply for exemptions that aren't intended by the legislature. So moving on to question 2, that answer is on page 18. To reiterate question 2, the question was how much real property had been donated to the 7 Kansas public universities and their foundations and is exempt from property tax. So about 98% of the appraised value of Kansas's 7 public universities and their foundations' real property was tax exempt in 2024. But we don't know how much of that real property was donated to universities because most universities don't keep that information. So in Kansas, there's 7 public universities, each with their own foundation or endowment association, and these organizations support each university by receiving financial donations or property donations on behalf of the university. Foundations can also acquire property for the university for future university projects. Both universities and foundations acquire property through grants, donations, and purchases. For our methods, they start on page 20. They were pretty simple for this audit. Universities and foundations self-reported information about the real property they owned in 2024 to us. It included information for exempt and taxable property. We checked those submissions against county records and the exemption data provided by KDOR to validate the information that they gave us. However, we were limited in the information that we could report about taxable real property owned by the University of Kansas Endowment Association and the Kansas State Foundation. These foundations didn't provide their taxable property to us. So we gathered as much information on the foundation's taxable properties as we could from public records, includes like public tax records and county appraiser records. We think we identified all of the taxable property that was titled to those organizations. However, we do know that foundations have separate entities that also own taxable property. We couldn't identify the taxable property owned by those entities. So looking over at Figure 6 on page 21, Figure 6 shows how much real property universities and their foundations owned in 2024 in terms of appraised value. So together, all 7 universities and their foundations owned about $4.5 billion of exempt and taxable real property. Kansas State University and the University of Kansas, along with their foundation, own the most real property in 2024, which is about 74% of that $4.5 billion total. And of that $4.5 billion total, about $4.4 billion was tax exempt. So this information can be found on page 22. And what this means is that most of the real property owned by universities and their foundations in 2024 was tax exempt. You'll also find information in this section about how universities and foundations reported using their tax exempt property. Typically, that was for educational or housing purposes. We also have Appendix C, which will list the exempt real property information for each university and foundation by the county it's located in for 2024. What we couldn't do in this section of the report is draw conclusions about how universities acquired their exempt property, and that's because most universities couldn't provide that information to us. And that's because this information isn't something that universities use, so it's not information that they maintain. We did put the information that universities could provide in Appendix D. So the foundations, on the other hand, could provide information about how they acquired their tax-exempt real property in 2024. But the foundations reported they owned only about $123 million out of that $4.4 billion of exempt property, which is only about 3%. The remaining 97% was owned by the universities. So for the exempt property owned by the foundations, they reported purchasing 73% of their property. 18% of their exempt property was exchanged between the universities and the foundation, which will sometimes happen with legislative approval. And the remaining 8% of the property was donated, or they couldn't determine how they acquired it. Finally, there is some additional information about the other types of real property universities and foundations may own on page 26. We had 2 recommendations for this audit. The first recommendation was the Kansas Department of Revenue should include the values for the new industrial revenue bond and economic development property tax exemption codes in the totals that they report in the statistical report of property assessment and taxation. And generally, KDOR should ensure the statistical report correctly compiles all relevant information and that the totals presented in the report are an accurate representation of the exempt value of the property in the state. The second recommendation is a consideration for the legislature, and that's the legislature should consider reviewing exemption statutes and eliminating ones that are outdated. This could include the 2 exemptions discussed in this report. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thanks, Sam. Committee, any questions? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so thank you for this, this audit. It definitely shows that we can't get to the bottom of the real issue, but it's helpful in, defining the parameters. My question is, when you had 72,000 properties that you were looking at, you don't have, and you did a sampling of 10, you don't have a way to electronically take those 72,000 properties and run them through any type of AI or to identify, let's say, for example, even X number of properties, 15%, for example, are universities, 10% are, it just seems like the coding's not right, the coding's unreliable, but it seems like certainly doesn't the Department of Revenue have a way or have a document or a report that says how many properties are, what percentage are each of the categories that you classified? And if they don't, would you have had an ability through AI to take that list of 72,000 and generate a report based on that?
I don't know what we could have done with AI. AI is kind of what you put in, what you get out. So the issue with the codes is also kind of an issue with titling as well. For example, you brought up the universities. So the universities, depending on the university, we'll just use University of Kansas for an example. The property they reported to us could have been titled to the University of Kansas, but it also may have been titled to the state of Kansas. It also may have been titled to Board of Regents. So depending on what the title is, it doesn't necessarily tell us who the current owner is, for state property anyway.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, so bottom line, the 72,000, you didn't have a massive Excel file with that? You did?
We do have a massive Excel file with all of those in there, and the coding issue and the titling issue makes it very difficult to tell exactly, short of an owner name like Bob Smith, who the owner of the property is. And
we can't even tell public schools?
Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you which public schools are. You could probably go by address.
Okay, well, that's something I think we should absolutely request for K-Board to be looking into, because I think that should be easy. That should be something that all of us know, that 17% is made up of these type of governmental entities and 5% are economic development. It's just a shame we don't have that. I did have one other question, and I've already forgotten it, so I'm going to pass.
That's okay. Sometimes the train gets off the tracks real fast. I'd have that too. Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Representative Williams for bringing this audit, and thank you for your work on it. It's good information, excellent for us to have. I'm curious a little bit, the data's, I know that has nothing to do with the report, but for a couple of years, we've been bringing in more property taxes than actually sales tax or income tax. It's interesting that income tax went up in 2024, but I'd like you to expand a little bit, if you could, on the counties that stood out, especially McPherson County on the energy exemption. You list possible of 4 counties that had. I can understand Riley County, that makes a lot of sense, but question the other 3, why their exemptions are so much higher and why they stand out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. So do these from memory. Riley County, we talked about Riley County. That's K-State and Fort Riley. Jackson County has a lot of tribal nation land there. That's federal exemption for that. I may mix up Morton and McPherson here, but I believe Morton County is southwest Kansas. That's the Cimarron National Grassland area. And then McPherson was the different county that had the one energy exemption that made up a substantial part of that exempt value.
So if I may, Mr. Chairman, yeah, that's the one I wanted to narrow in on, McPherson County. But also, we do have a problem with Jackson County because the tribe is definitely exempt in that area. But I'm finding out that they're buying properties off-site And those properties are now being exempted from property taxes that are in other counties. The tribe is expanding their exemptions in a big way. So that needs to be on our radar. But would you, I'm not sure why McPherson County, what energy exemption? Is there a plant there?
There is a very large, I believe it's an oil refinery in McPherson.
And they don't pay property tax?
It is an IRBX, if I remember correctly, based on the data that we were given.
No, that's what I was driving at. It was a local decision
Yes.
to provide a property tax exemption. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Williams.
And I know it's not the scope of the audit, but I don't think that there's any requirement for local entities to disclose the total number or the total amount of exemptions that they have provided. It would be really helpful for our constituency to know how many properties in their communities don't, other than those that are government and nonprofit. Thank you.
So, I mean, with this 98% of the properties pretty much rubber, is it just like a rubber stamp? They're owned by the educational facility or something, they just get an exemption?
Is that for the university?
Yes,
question too?
universities or whatever. It just seems like if 98% of the property is tax exempt, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of pushback.
So we didn't evaluate the process on how the exemption process, but according to state law, universities have to go through the same process when they acquire a new property. So they have to go through BOTA and they have to get approved for the exemption. Now, once it's exempt, as long as the property doesn't change hands, it doesn't have to go through that process again.
Okay. Any other questions? What's that? Cable, no, we don't have, we do have officials from the universities available. Emporia State, Fort Hays, Washburn, Wichita, Kansas State, Pittsburgh, KU, Board of Regents, Department of Revenue. We do have Department of Revenue. Bob Kent here's. If, do you have a question for Bob? Is Bob here? Bob, step on up, sir. I think Representative Williams has a question for you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So really, I want to get to the bottom of the coding, and it says that it's going to be kind of impossible at this point to get the correct coding. So my question is two-part. Number one, is this something that Kansas Department of Revenue can take a hard look at and get our codes in line with our counties so we can have clear information? And number two, is there any type of report or documentation that you regularly have that I'm not aware of that discloses, for example, the different types or the data relating to the different types of exemptions?
Yeah, well, question number one, can you repeat the question, number one?
So first of all, there's a problem with the coding. So that, my question is, I know that's a county issue, it's a revenue issue, but I'm sure with the direction of the Department of Revenue, there could be some corrections, or do you need legislative action in order for coding to be correctly at least applied, or at least have some type of uniformity?
I think it's on the counties. I think the information's there, or the potential to get the information there. I think we can work with the counties to make that process better. One of the things that we have exemption codes. For example, exempt religious, for example. Under that code, and if I'm misstating this, I have help here, but we might have statutes we might have 5 or 6, 7 statutes that cover those. And I think that's what the audit is getting at, is that they would like to see a breakdown more specifically of exactly what statute was, coded by statute. And the software doesn't allow us to do that. What we can do is try to make sure that we have all the exemptions, the statutory exemptions included in that data set or in those code files.
Yes, I mean, it seems like the software should be able to, if you had, let's say, 20 different codes, that underneath those codes, you would be able to have, maybe one has 5 statutes, maybe one only has 2 statutes. So that would all become under a religious organization, even though there were, additional. So it seems like there's got to be a way to do that. So I hope that there is. And then the other question I was asking you is, do you have any report that we could look at that maybe shows how many religious institutions, or what percentage, and how many, what are our K through 12? And if not, if you were to run this report of 72,000 properties, could you, right or wrong with the codes, assuming the codes may be wrong, could you generate a report based on the codes that you already have to give us that information?
I think that's possible. Would you agree? Yeah, I think it's possible, yeah. Okay. Now, breaking it up K through 12, I'm not sure we're going to have that information. Something owned or exempted by a school district, I think we would have that.
Yes, that's pretty much what I meant. Yeah. Mr. Chair, if it would be agreeable to you, it would be great if Department of Revenue would provide us a little bit of, a follow-up to this, which would maybe fill the gaps for anything that we weren't able to ascertain from this audit, and perhaps give us, if we need legislative changes to help our counties comply, then I think that would be important as well.
Okay,
Thank you.
so recommended. Bob, does that sound doable for you guys from Department of Revenue?
I think it is, yeah. Well,
Okay.
I think it is.
We
Yeah.
appreciate that. And again, I think legislation, if necessary, to force these counties to report this stuff, it would be helpful for us. So they could, get the coding correct, uniform statewide, that would be
I
done.
think, we will work with them. We'll go back through the audit and look at specifics. We'll look at some things. I think there's some things that we can work on with them that'll make things a little bit better. In the request you just made, or would you be expecting to see the 72,000 records or the grouping of those 72,000 records?
I think that primarily, if you look at the audit, we're looking for grouping. I think grouping would be helpful to us. I don't think we're trying to get into the weeds of all the different variables or variations, but I think particularly, looking at McPherson with the large IBX, that may be a larger percentage, and maybe some others, it's their universities or their community colleges. So I think just the major areas, and I think you can take it from this audit, what those major areas might be. And in addition, they weren't able to follow the trail of other types of exemptions that relate to property tax. And there's a page on there. If you could follow the trail on that, or give us an idea on how best to follow the trail or what we need to do, that would be good. These are, in the future, within a few years, Representative Tarwater reminded me, they are subject to be reported on our transparency database by the local governments. So they will be adding them. And of course, Department of Revenue is also supposed to be providing data on HPIP on our transparency database, and we don't have that yet either. Thank you.
Time for one quickie, and then we need to move on. Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank Bob and your group. You guys do a great job, very responsive. In fact, they provided a report for some of us this summer that included property tax exemptions, whether by statute or by, I don't know if you'd want to include that information with it, but it did show whether it was churches, what types of property and stuff. We didn't have the dollar amounts. I'd like to add the dollar amounts to that report if possible, but you did provide some excellent information. I think Representative Williams is absolutely right. We need to chase this down. And I don't know when it's required to be online, but the sooner the better. We may need to move that up, and we need to put some teeth in it, because we heard yesterday it's almost 4 years now for HPIP to not be updated. So And I know that has nothing to do with you, Bob, but
Yeah,
yeah.
doing nothing but HPIP, I'm sorry.
We're going to cover that next week. So, yeah, in our next meeting, HPIP
Okay.
is going to be.
Representative Reynolds, do you have a page reference that you're referencing your,
I could actually even email, if you email me, I'll email you.
okay?
That sound good? Thank you.
All righty. We need to move on. We've got another audit to get through before our time expires today. Thank you very much, Bob. We appreciate it. Next up, we have Heidi, who is going to present the audit on SNAP error rates. This just came in very late, and we apologize for that. So I know you didn't have a chance to review this, so we'll be following along with Heidi on this audit. Heidi?
Good afternoon. I am here to present the SNAP audit, at least SNAP Part 1. As Senator Thompson mentioned, you all probably just got this morning because we wrapped it up late yesterday afternoon. So we'll go ahead and get through this, and hopefully we'll have enough time for some questions if you have questions since you're just getting to look at it for the first time. But this audit was completed by Maury Exline, Megan Bishop, and Caitlin Abraham. Matt Etzel was the manager. The original audit proposal included 2 questions, but we split the report into the audit into 2 reports, and we'll release a report related to benefit card transactions later. So for now, we're just going to have question 1, and that question is on page 2. So what caused DCF's overpayment and underpayment rates for SNAP to exceed the federal government's standard in recent years? So the short answer, which is on page 4, is that DCF's payment error rate exceeded federal standards in fiscal years 2023 and 2024 for multiple reasons, including high staff turnover, the complexity of the SNAP eligibility rules, and inconsistent verification efforts. So I'll also give you the long answer now, but I'll start with a little bit of background, which is also still on page 4. So the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, is a federal program that provides monthly funds to low-income families to buy food. The United States Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, administers the program. However, the Kansas Department for Children and Families handles the day-to-day operations within the state. So currently, the federal government funds the full cost of SNAP benefits. However, the state's administrative costs are split evenly between the state and the federal government, but I'll talk about some changes to that here in just a minute. In federal fiscal year 2025, the federal government spent about $403 million on SNAP benefits for Kansans. And in fiscal year 2025, about 188,000 Kansas received SNAP benefits each month. So to qualify for SNAP benefits, an individual must submit an application to DCF. The application can be completed online or on paper. Applicants must provide a variety of non-financial information to assure that they qualify. That includes information like Social Security numbers or marital status and criminal history. And then the application also requires extensive financial information. This includes information like income, which includes wages, Social Security, child support, and alimony, other resources such as savings, vehicles, or other property, and then expenses such as rent or mortgage payments, medical expenses, or utility costs. So most applicants must meet 2 financial criteria to qualify for SNAP benefits. The first is that the applicant's gross monthly income must be at or below 130% of the federal poverty line, and the applicant's net monthly income must be at or below 100% of the federal poverty line. The exception here, though, is that households with an elderly or disabled member only needs to meet the net monthly income test. So the amount of the benefit is based on the size of the household and the household's net monthly income. In 2025, the average benefit was about $360 per household per month. So federal laws and regulations require DCF to take certain steps to verify each application. Federal law requires DCF to verify certain information that the applicant provided with agencies such as the IRS, Social Security Administration, and the Kansas Department of Labor. This includes information such as the applicant's Social Security number and certain wage information. DCF uses a simplified eligibility system by which the department generally accepts what the applicant reports on the application. However, DCF also uses a prudent person standard to determine if they should request documentation. So except for the information the federal government requires DCF to verify, DCF generally will only request documents if a prudent person would find the information questionable or inconsistent. So an example includes things like an individual who has a history of providing conflicting information or seems to have a higher standard of living than the reported income would permit. The DCF takes a number of steps to process and verify information providing on that application. So first of all, DCF staff manually enter paper applications into the Kansas Eligibility Enforcement System, or KEYS. Online applications are automatically added. DCF staff conduct a mandatory interview with the applicant as well. And during that interview, staff review the application for completeness. Again, using that prudent person standard, staff may ask for verification documents to confirm any inconsistent or questionable information provided on that application. Then staff review any documents and verify the information that the federal government requires them to verify. Then staff input that relevant information into KEYS, and KEYS determines whether the applicant is eligible for benefits. And if they are, KEYS also automatically calculates the amount of monthly SNAP benefit. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the payment error rate that the federal government monitors, and I'm on page 8. The federal government monitors states on multiple metrics to ensure accurate payments, timely application processing, and appropriate access to SNAP. For the purpose of this audit, though, we are focusing only on the accuracy of the payments. The payment error rate provides a measure of the state's accuracy in determining benefit amounts. So determining this measure consists of kind of 3 broad steps. So first of all, each month, DCF selects a representative and random sample of monthly payments for review. It's about 90 a month. Then a DCF quality control reviewer checks the accuracy of that payment determination. Federal rules prohibit this reviewer from having any previous participation in the sample cases. The reviewer reviews any supporting documentation and interviews household members or others to determine whether the recipient reported accurately and whether DCF staff made the correct decision. If the quality control reviewer finds errors, DCF must notify the applicant and correct the benefit amount. And then USDA does review a sample of the cases that DCF reviewed to verify the accuracy of the state's findings. So the payment error rate for the state is calculated by dividing the total value of certain over and under payments by the total value of SNAP benefits in the sample for that time period. The federal government has set a payment error rate tolerance threshold of 6%, and states are required to implement a corrective action plan if their annual payment error rate is 6% or greater. We looked at the payment error rate for each year for the last 20 years, and the figure on page 9 shows Kansas's payment error rate each year since 2003. So as the figure shows, Kansas's payment error rate has exceeded the federal tolerance threshold of 6% since 2019. Further, it has significantly exceeded that threshold since 2022, and it reached its highest level in 20 years in 2023 when it reached 12%. However, Kansas's payment error rate was slightly less than the national average in 2024. In that year, the national payment error rate was 10.9%. Kansas's rate was 10%. And in 2024, only 8 states had a payment error rate equal to or less than that federal threshold of 6%. So it's important to note here real fast that the payment error rate is not a fraud rate. So while some errors could be fraud, other errors are likely to be just basic human error. And basic human error is not typically considered fraud. So it's important to not conflate those two concepts. We looked at the errors, though, from 2023 and 2024 to try to understand what types of errors they were. And I'm on page 10. So due to federal laws that prevent DCF from providing SNAP applications to us, we were unable to directly review the SNAP applications. As a result, we had to rely on documentation provided by DCF that notes the types of errors and the primary cause of those errors as they determined them. So we reviewed the nearly 2,200 payments that DCF selected as their payment error rate sample for fiscal years 2023 and 2024. So out of those cases, 286 had errors large enough to include in the federal payment error rate calculation. So as part of DCF's review, they determined whether the error was primarily due to the recipient or to DCF error. So based on that review, across the 2 years, DCF attributed about half the errors to DCF staff. That included errors like staff that incorrectly prorated benefits, staff that allowed ineligible expenses, and then failing to update income. The other half was attributed to recipients. So for example, we saw some payments where an individual did not report the number of household members correctly and did not report that they were receiving benefits in another state or that they misreported expenses. So we categorize the payment errors by type of error based on DCF's description. So across the 2 years, most of the errors were related to mistakes in the calculation of the applicant's income and resources. I'm on the bottom of page 11 to go through these numbers. So the numbers I'm about to give you, they don't add up to 100% though, because there were a number of payments that actually had multiple errors. But 59% of the payments had at least one error related to the recipient's income and resources. So some of these errors included recipients who did not report all their wages or all of their Social Security income, or DCF did not properly include child support or alimony payments or Social Security income. 33% of the payments had at least one error related to an allowed expense. So this includes applicants who did not accurately report expenses such as childcare expenses or rent. And then 17% of the payments had at least one non-financial error. So for example, we saw a student who was incorrectly reported as part of a household, a non-citizen who was granted benefits, and an incomplete application that DCF accepted. To understand why these errors occurred, we reviewed DCF's payment error documentation and talked with DCF officials about the root causes of the department's error rates. We noted a few things. So first of all, DCF officials told us that recent turnover among the staff who process applications has been about 30%. Significant turnover leads to a consistent influx of new people who may not yet have the necessary experience to accurately process applications. Additionally, the rules that determine SNAP eligibility and the proper payment amounts are nuanced and complex. Additionally, staff must know the rules for additional programs like TANF and child care assistance. And this increase in the complexity, this increases the complexity of making sure that the correct rules and the correct criteria are applied for SNAP. Then last, DCF uses a prudent person standard to determine what information may be questionable. This is a somewhat vague standard, and it appears to have created some inconsistency in what is verified and how far different staff go to verify questionable information. DCF officials told us that 2 modifications to keys would likely help reduce errors. DCF has not implemented these features yet because of a lack of funding. First, they told us a chatbot assistant that would provide the rules to the staff as they were processing the application could reduce errors. They also told us a document processing feature that would scan applicant documents and then automatically populate the proper field would also likely reduce some errors. We had a couple of other findings on page 14. So across the 2 years that we reviewed, we identified several hundred additional errors that were not included in the federal payment error rate because the dollar value of that error was less than the federal reporting threshold. So by federal rule, only errors that exceed a specific dollar value are counted in the payment error rate. So that value is $54 in 2023 and $56 in 2024. So we reviewed all the errors DCF identified, including the ones that were reported as part of the federal payment error rate. And across the 2 years that we reviewed, DCF reviewed almost 2,200 payments and identified errors with 970 of them. So this means that nearly half of all the payments DCF selected for review had some sort of error in them. Then last, in 2025, Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which imposes cost-sharing penalties on states whose payment error rate is equal to or greater than 6%. If the Kansas payment error rate remains at the levels of the last few years, the state will be responsible for paying 10 to 15% of SNAP costs. Total SNAP costs in 2024 were a little over $400 million. So that could be about 40 to 60 million in state funding. And then regardless of the state's payment error rate, starting in fiscal year 2027, the federal government will fund 25% of the state's administrative costs rather than 50%. This will likely increase Kansas's administrative share of SNAP costs by $15 to $20 million. So to conclude, the state's SNAP payment error rate has significantly increased since 2017, and it has exceeded the federal error threshold since 2019. The root cause of these errors appear to be related to a few things: the complexity of the SNAP program, DCF staff turnover and inconsistent verification efforts all contributed to these errors. But Kansas does not appear to be alone with these issues. As of 2024, only 8 states had payment error rates at or below the federal threshold of 6%. So this suggests that other states are also facing some of the same challenges we are when it comes to correctly determining SNAP eligibility and benefits. So we made one recommendation. It's on page 15. It's the Department for Children and Families, those officials to pursue funding opportunities for those 2 additional KEYS modules that we discussed in the report. So that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Heidi. Questions? I think Representative Williams has some.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on page 10, it says that the DCF would not provide SNAP application to you. They provided the data, but they did not provide the applications because of federal law. Did you ascertain that, or did they tell you they could not because of federal law?
We ascertained that. We reviewed the federal law ourselves as well as their advisors, and there is simply no exception in federal law to provide certain kinds of information to state auditors.
Okay, so, and I trust that to be true. However, just doing a quick review of the law, I mean, there's specific statements that say may be disclosed to persons directly connected with administration, enforcement, or oversight. So I'm intrigued by that. I'm also kind of concerned because this issue of not turning over the application or the roles, we're finding that in other areas too. So our audit reports are never going to be really fully accurate if we can't actually see the applications. So I'm just intrigued by that because everything that I'm searching says that we should be able to have access to it.
I'm not an attorney, but I believe the interpretation was that we simply didn't fall into the exceptions. We are not law enforcement, and we are not really in charge of administration. So I believe that was part of the interpretation on that.
All right, keep discussing it.
That's it. Senator Petty.
Thank you, and thanks for this presentation. I think it does answer a lot of questions about SNAP. Just to clarify, so SNAP does bring $403 million that you had in here into the economy of Kansas.
That is what the federal government spends on SNAP benefits for the state.
Kansas.
In Kansas,
Yes.
correct.
Which brings $403 million into Kansas, spent in Kansas, used by Kansans to provide food for their families, and which pays for, keeps stores open, is fed into our economy. You've got that in the, you don't have that in the report. That's my addition to here. You also, it seems that on page 6 and 7, where you went over the steps that DCF is required to take to process the application, it's very staff intensive. Would this be correct?
Yes, I believe that would be correct. They are taking a number of steps and checking with a variety of agencies and requesting documentation if they feel that it needs to. So yes, it is a very staff-intensive process.
Yeah, I forgot to bring it up here with me, but I had someone drop off the application to me this morning. It's either 24 pages or...
It is 36 pages.
36 pages.
With over 200 questions.
It was, there's a lot there.
It is.
And then let's see, I had one more note. So I wondered, as you were looking at the one big beautiful bill and that this is spoken to, that 6%, was there any basis for that 6% threshold?
We had trouble finding the origin of that 6% threshold. It has existed for a very long time, though. We were able to track it back, I believe, into the 90s. But as to why the federal government set it at 6% and what the origin is, we just were not able to discover what the origin of that was. But we do know it has existed for quite a while.
So it's been in place, but it hasn't been the threshold that is now with the one big beautiful bill. Would that be correct?
The 6% threshold has existed for a long time in terms of they want to see that payment error rate under 6%. And if you were over that 6%, that triggers a corrective action plan. That has been the case for a very long time. The one big beautiful bill, though, is kind of the first time we've seen penalties associated with that 6% threshold.
And the other change that occurred from changing from the 50%, 50/50 to now the state's assuming 25, the state's assuming 75% and the Fed's only 25%, that's brand new.
That is brand new as well, and it is unrelated to the payment error rate. So every state is going to pay 75% now, regardless of their payment error rate. That's just across the board.
It's just shifted those costs back to the states.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're running very short on time. I do have Dr. Carla Whiteside Hicks, who is here to make a few remarks, and then if we have any questions for her, Senator Tyson, did you
Just
have?
real quick, there was comment made that the money's in Kansas, spent in Kansas. There is no restriction on where they spend the money once they get the card. Isn't that correct? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The next audit, the next part 2 of SNAP will deal with that issue a little bit more.
There's a lot to this. There's an awful lot to this. Thank you. Thank you, Heidi. I appreciate it. Dr. Hicks, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chair. And Senator Tyson, if I may, you are correct. You can spend your SNAP dollars anywhere in the United States. We do have a way, and I'm sure Heidi will present this when in part 2. We do in our EBT system, we can tell when benefits have been spent out of state, and it's typically in border states. I live in Wyandotte County. It is common to shop in Missouri because that could be the closest grocery store. Yeah.
Any questions for Dr. Hicks? I do have one. Did you notice in these error rates, and maybe Heidi can, if you don't, any particular one source where you're seeing applications in schools, for example, where students are being signed up for SNAP benefits? Are you seeing a higher error rate there, or in other locations where you can identify this is an area we need to really watch?
We have not tracked the errors for specifically where the application was received. We track the type of error, so income or expenses. Those are the things that we look at to try to identify what we can do. And I will note that in the report, you will see that we did hire a contractor. That contractor started in October of '25. However, we just received our confirmed SNAP payment error rates for the month of August. And we had already come down to 5.5%, which indicates that, and it was over 9%. So that just indicates that we were on the right path, and we still are on the right path to be able to bring that error rate down. And the contractor is just assisting us with what we had already had in place.
I know one of the concerns was the underreporting of income from applicants and things of that nature. To me, if that's deliberate, that's not error, that's fraud.
And that is typically not at application. It is somewhere between application and for a regular household, that 6-month review. So I reported at application that I was working at a certain place and I made $10 an hour. Well, when you get your notice that says, you've been approved for SNAP, it clearly states if your household income goes above this dollar amount, you have to let us know. I threw that paper in the trash, and so I did not report to you that I got a raise and I'm not making $10 an hour, now I'm making $15 an hour. So what we're and it's between that approval and that 6-month where I have to report. So that is something that we are trying to address with hopefully some technology that will help us identify those households so that we can address those.
Okay. Wish we had Senator Petty very quick.
Thank you. So under those recommendations, could you just quickly tell us a little more about how that will help with the error rate?
What it will do, so one of the things that we have noticed are is training, that we need to make sure that we are properly training our staff, because as Heidi mentioned, there's a lot that is going on in their world. And so some of the technology will help to use some simulation in terms of interviewing. So if I'm interviewing you when you apply for SNAP and you've reported that you do not have income, but you're reporting that your rent is $1,700 a month and you are paying utilities, I need to ask you how you are paying those bills if you have no income. So that could lead to, oh yeah, there's someone else who lives in my household, things like that. So just making sure that our eligibility workers understand when they need to ask follow-up questions to make sure that we are capturing everything correctly. And then the IDP, the document processing system, that will allow us to, if I submit electronic documents, it's like when you do your taxes online, and I could upload my W-2, and all of a sudden, all that information just shows up on my tax form. It will do that, so that would reduce the errors that might happen just from typos.
I mean, as my colleague mentioned about AI, I think this is definitely showing that the technology can help a great deal to help with that error rate.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sure if you need to contact Dr. Hicks, she'll be available for any additional questions afterward. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. We need to move on and finish things up with the consent calendar. And Kristen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. If you want to turn to tab A in your committee notebooks, that's where the consent calendar is. There are 2 items on today's consent calendar. The first of those is approval of your minutes from your last meeting, which was January 13th. You'll see those as attachment A in tab A. And then the second item is acceptance of the performance audits presented today. So that includes the property tax exemption audit that Sam presented and then SNAP that Heidi presented.
Anyone who was not here and would like to abstain from approval of the minutes? I think you weren't there, okay. How do we do it? We just make a motion to approve on the consent calendar.
Yeah, I think as long as Senator Petty, if you want to abstain and make that known, we'll keep that in the minutes.
Okay. Is there a motion to object to the approval of the minutes or the consent calendar? Seeing none, those are approved. And I think the only additional business is next meeting date, correct?
Correct.
Okay, which is next week.
Correct.
Okay.
You want me to take over?
Yeah, go ahead. You can go ahead and take over.
Okay, so yes, next meeting is Wednesday, January 28th, same time, noon, this room. The first portion of the meeting will be KDOR presenting an update on the HPIP data. You know, that came up today. The second half will be the Department of Commerce. So statutorily, they are required to present to this committee and give an overview of their economic development incentives. And so that will be the second half of the meeting. I think the other thing that we were talking about, maybe having some discussion about or entertaining today would be scheduling the meeting after that one as early as the following Wednesday, which would be Wednesday, February 4th, also at noon. We do have 2 IT security audits that would be ready to present then if you all are able to make that work.
On the 4th. Committee, how's the 4th sound? Any objection to the 4th? I think we'll go ahead and put 4th on the calendar then for that and go from there. And then also, Kristen, if you'll mention the survey that we were supposed to send out and apparently got lost in the ether somewhere.
Yes, so you all, just a quick jog of your memories, you all asked that we send a survey to the full legislature to ask for feedback on our work product, some of the committee's actions, things like that. We did send that email out, but apparently, yes, it got blocked. So we're working with the LOIS to try and figure out how to work around that, and I think we have a solution and are expecting that at the latest, we would be able to resend that survey link out by the end of this week. So if you happen to talk to any of your colleagues about it, maybe just remind them it is coming. We would like people to fill it out.
You could, if you could, just when that's ready, maybe send me and the vice chair a note that we can make second announcements on the floor to remind people to fill out the survey. I'd appreciate that.
Okay.
Thank you, Kristen, very much. I think I misspoke. The lunch was provided by the Kansas Chamber. I said Eric Stafford, but it was actually Kansas Chamber. Well, Eric's with them, so same deal. Committee, I believe we've got a meeting next week. Thank you for your work today. We are adjourned.